Thank you all for joining us again this month for De Jong Reid's webinar. Very excited today that I've got Sophie Serpantis from our Melbourne office joining us. I think she is as excited as Jacinta was to be part of the program, but it should be a really good session. So welcome, Sophie.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome.
So before we get stuck into the topic, I normally do a little bit of an update on what's happening in the world, from an insolvency perspective anyway. And to be fair, there's probably not a lot to talk about this month on the back of April having so many holidays with Easter and Anzac Day and all the rest of it. There is a natural drop off in insolvency rates in April, which flows through to some activity through into May. So probably a slightly quieter month, and certainly from a new legislation point of view, nothing major or any major court cases to talk about. So we'll move on and get stuck into things. And Sophie, I guess it's probably to start with a bit of an opportunity to why don't we start with a little bit about where you've come from and what brought you to be here with De Jong Reid.
Sure. So I actually started off in banking. I was in corporate finance, business finance, some would say on the right side of the balance sheet, lending out money. And then I moved into the loan recovery area, which was really, really interesting and a huge learning curve. And from that, I actually moved into the insolvency space itself. So doing corporate liquidations and personal bankruptcies, again, huge learning curve. And I'm here today. And for me, my background, I suppose, with the banking, the finance and the recovery side of things, it all meshes in quite nicely. So I understand the finance, I understand the insolvency and the risks, and that helps me to come up with a really good strategy for our clients and help them get them through whatever ails them.
Yeah, you certainly got some insight, particularly into dealing with the asset finance side of recoveries. Can be very helpful on files. So about 4 years, I think it is, that you've been with us down here in Melbourne now.
It's actually coming on to 5.
Five you've been putting up with me. Well,
yes.
There you go. Okay, let's move on from that then. So when we talked about what we wanted to talk about in this webinar today, you decided to try and push a slightly different approach, and you know, we commonly talk with our primary focus on helping companies and individuals who are in financial distress, but today you sort of wanted to move a little bit away from that, and your focus is going to be on where we can help people where financial distress isn't the key factor.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, though, I'm going to test your a little bit more of your knowledge on small business restructures. So it's legislation that's been around for a little while, and it's become quite the talking point around town. We've found over the last probably 6 months, they seem to have really picked up their conversation. So why do you think that is?
Probably a couple of reasons. One is it is new, and it's the first piece of new legislation in the insolvency space for around 30 years. So it gives people something to talk about. The other interesting thing about it is it somewhat moved the needle a little bit for companies in distress, because it now means that a liquidator can sort of work with them rather than seemingly against them to try and get the company through that whole process of liquidation or winding up or whatever it happens to be. And in Australia, for the first time, it's actually the first time that we have what's called a debtor in control model. And that's something to talk about. It's never been there before, so it's piqued everyone's curiosity.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, why don't we take a step back and just tell, just for those who may not know what SBR, what the small business restructure is, why don't you just explain a little bit about what the model actually is?
Sure. So it came in early 2021, and it was really designed to provide some options for small businesses under distress. There are some eligibility criteria. The key ones are the company's debts have to be less than $1 million. Now that includes related party debts and secured creditors. The company has to have all its tax lodgements up to date, and it also has had to have paid all its employee entitlements. The big difference is that once an SBR practitioner is appointed, it's actually the director that continues to run the business on a day-to-day basis. And that's really in stark contrast to the VA and DOCA process, where it's the administrator that runs the business once they're appointed.
And I guess really this model really only makes sense when you start comparing it to the VA and DOCA process, really, isn't it?
It does, but there are some key changes, and those changes really make it simpler and cheaper for a small business owner to actually take advantage of it. But there are some limits to it. So whilst the director runs the business on a day-to-day basis, they can't do anything outside the ordinary course of business. So they can't suddenly decide that they're going to sell plant and equipment or anything like that. The other difference between the SBR process and a VA process is that related parties cannot vote in an SBR. It's only unrelated third parties that can vote for the plan.
Right. So we're talking about voting. We're sort of going to the end of the process. So we're jumping through to the end part there. So just talk about what are they voting on and how does that all work in an SBR?
Okay, so once the SBR is appointed, the director's got 20 days to come up with an offer to settle all the company's debts. The offer can be cents in the dollar, it can be a set amount, it can be payment over time. If it is payment over time, it can't extend beyond 3 years. That plan is then communicated by the SBR practitioner to creditors, and creditors have 15 days to vote on it. There is no physical meeting, all the voting is done by post. If the offer is accepted, the money's paid, and the business continues to run, happy days. If it's not accepted, and this is the interesting thing, the director stays in control. Still has all the company debts to deal with, so he's got to come up with another plan.
Right, and he's pretty much he's told them all that he doesn't have the ability to pay everyone at the same time, hasn't he? So that makes it a really interesting scenario.
It does.
Yeah. So win or lose, the director gets to keep control of the company. If it's accepted, obviously he pays the extra money under whatever the plan is and moves on. But if he loses, then all of a sudden he's stuck. He's in a real quandary. Yeah. So I think making sure you've got a plan of how that's all going to play out and understanding the voting and who's going to vote and what's going to vote becomes really critical.
That's right. And that's something that we always talk about. You need to have the right plan for the right circumstances, but you also need to do a whole lot of work beforehand to understand what the plan is going to look like, and to understand which way you expect creditors to vote.
Right. Yeah. So I think I've asked this. I asked it a bit earlier, but so why is it getting so much attention at the moment?
The cynic in me says that it's a new marketing angle for some people. But the other side of the coin is that this has really been something that's very sadly lacking, or has been sadly lacking in the Australian economy. The VA and DOCA process, as good as it is, can be prohibitively expensive for a small business owner, but the SBR process with a lower cost can work for a small business owner. But again, it's got to be for the right circumstances, and it is just one of the tools that are available to us to help our clients.
Yeah, and I think that's probably for me, like we're hearing a lot of practitioners talking about it. They're trying to promote it, and we're here to help and all that sort of stuff. If it doesn't go right, then they're going to be putting their hand up to say, I'll take the liquidation on the back end of it, which they're more familiar with, they're more used to. But the other thing is that if you're looking at this in the right light, it's nothing more than a tool. So if we use that one, if we use liquidation, if we use VA, it's nice to have that one now because, I know over the years, we've often looked at wanting to do a VA and DOCA for a small business, but it was going to cost 100 and 150 grand. And, the business couldn't afford that. So you weren't left with options. So it is a great option, but again, only at the right time.
That's right.
Right. So let's move on to what's obviously something that you're quite passionate about and using our skill sets not for, so, I guess the, businesses that are needing to do types of restructures, but the stress is not the key factor, is not the primary focus of it. So let's jump into examples of what, and why don't you explain why we wanted to go down this path? Why don't you this was something you pushed quite hard on.
Yeah, it was because we often talk about financial distress, and truth be told, we're really, really good at it. We're known for it. But over the 4 or so years that I have been here, I found that the team has a really, really good skill set and a really good level of expertise that is transferable. It's transferable to helping those clients that need a restructure, but it's not necessarily financial distress that's causing them to think about restructuring their business.
Yep.
We may still need a liquidator at the end of it, but that's not the key driver. And I think we highlighted some examples in today's invitation, like a change in purpose, right sizing or downsizing a business, and even addressing the impact of health issues. Like we're talking, the director's health issues, and they're not being able to continue to almost turn up daily to the business, let alone make real decisions.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, it's so true. Like, we've talked about closing down solvent companies because there are tax benefits. I'm going to get into advice on tax benefits. We've talked about controlled shutdowns, all that sort of thing, but there can be a number of reasons for it as well. So let's jump into it. So why don't we start with your example of a change of purpose, I think, to a social enterprise?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I have to admit, I know what a social enterprise is, but I really didn't understand the structure behind it, the company type or anything like that. And I suppose it's worthwhile making the point. It wasn't me that recommended the social enterprise move. It was actually the client and the accountant, and specifically the accountant, who is a very good friend of De Jong Reid. Once they realised and got talking a little bit more about the future direction of the business, he called us in to help because he knew that we could actually help implement the change process.
Right, so I was going to ask you what a social enterprise was, but we probably should just keep it our lane and just focus on the restructure part, and not so much on what one of those things are.
Yeah, definitely stay in our lane. But in saying that, we still had to do enough research to be able to understand it so that we could actually develop the restructuring plan. Like, what do we have to do? What do we have to address? All those sorts of things. So in simple terms, though, the social enterprise, it's a business. It needs a structure. It doesn't operate for profit. It operates for some community good. So then once we realised that, it was all about implementing the process and effectively getting to the point where the social enterprise business was able to purchase the business from the old entity, own all the assets, and be able to actually provide the service that it wanted to the community.
So, and it's interesting, it's not always about it's a community service, but the profits often need to flow to the community as part of it under these things. It's a really interesting thing that we're seeing a bit more of, but over the years, we've seen a lot of examples where, even without taking out social enterprise, we've seen someone start up a small business, and then as they've grown, the accountant's gone, well, you really need a company structure. They may not have wanted to spend the money on the company structure to start with. So we've seen a lot of that transition from sole trader to company to trust to companies. And a lot of the time they're moved without valuations and documentation or having any type of restructure consultant in play. Why would this be any different?
Essentially, it's not.
Right.
When you're talking about moving or selling a business and its assets without valuable consideration, it can cause problems down the track, particularly if things don't go well.
And I guess I was being a little bit loaded in that, because we have a lot of issues that come out of people who don't do these restructures the right way. So I'm going to put you on the spot and get you to expand a little bit further on that.
Sure. So when you move a business from one structure to another, there has to be a proper process. It's not just a case of shutting doors one day and opening doors under another name or a company name the next day. Otherwise, you can, as I said, get into problems if it doesn't work out down the track. So to take the example of sole trader to company, quite often a sole trader will forget, neglect, or doesn't even think that they've got to do it, but they don't close their trading accounts and reopen new ones in the company name. They don't transfer assets across. So when you get to a liquidation scenario, there's all sorts of confusion about where the debts lie, where the assets sit. And by just putting the company into liquidation, the sole trader might just find that it's all fallen back on them because the debts are still in their name. They were never in the company's name. When you're talking about a social enterprise, you don't want that falling back on, well, A, you don't want it falling back on the directors, but B, you don't want to let the community down, because all of a sudden that great piece of work that you were doing, you're no longer able to do it.
Hasn't been set up right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's simple little things like they might borrow a car in their own name, but the company pays for it. So they think it's a company car and it's not. And in these scenarios, they all fall apart. So thank you for that one. Like it's become an increasing trend. I think just in the last 6 months alone, I'm aware of 3 restructures we're doing into social enterprises for different reasons. I think 2 years ago, I can't say I'd ever even heard of it, but now it's becoming something that more businesses are getting themselves involved in.
Yeah.
So another one that we're seeing a lot of, and I think this is probably a little bit more, there's logic behind it, is in the last 12 months, we've seen a lot of people coming to us to right-size their business. So why don't we talk about what right-sizing is to start with? Okay.
Sure. Effectively, we're talking about changing the business structure to bring it in line with the current market. And especially over the last few years, a lot of businesses have faced changing market conditions, changing market pressures, supply lines, production times. Sometimes they come to a realization that they really don't need the 5 or 6 sites that they used to have. So effectively, the business structure is no longer right for the current market.
Right. So, and there's no doubt that's happening. There's a lot of that going on. I think if you bring in all the different factors, that's happening everywhere. But it sounds a lot more like cost management than and cost management isn't really normally an area that De Jong Reid would focus on, because that's not really our specialty.
No, it's not, and we don't do it. But it's usually the go-to area for most clients and a lot of advisors themselves. You look where you can cut down your costs to improve your profitability. But when you've done all the cost cutting, and you can only go so far, it's like, well, where do you go from there? If I can probably give you an example, I've just finished a restructure where we've restructured a business where they were geared for annual turnover of about $8 million a year. Now, they had trade finance facilities, debtor finance facilities, term loan facilities. They also had surplus plant and equipment. Now, that's not all of it easy to deal with. So the client and the referrer came to us saying, can we help? And the referrer knew that we could help because we've helped him with some of his other clients, but he also knew that we could actually deal with some of the landlord issues as well, which were obviously at play in this example. But again, there were some financial pressures in the background because obviously the client was looking at cost-cutting measures. So there was all those market conditions, but there were also some financial pressure sitting in the background as well.
Right. Okay. So, and it was, so they went, well, we've done all the basic stuff, but there's some big ticket items that they weren't sure about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in all of what you've just said. So I think the best thing I can do is just stay out of the way. It's an example of yours. I'll let you run for a bit longer.
Okay. Okay. So we did the restructure. And what it looked like, or what it meant for the client, was in terms of their leases, we actually had some real strength in dealing with the landlords, because all of a sudden a landlord had a tenant that was no longer the operating entity. So we were able to deal effectively with the leases. Then we turned to the financing requirements, and I'm going to say it was almost a double-edged sword, because there were banking facilities in the old client that obviously had to be reduced and ultimately paid out. And then we needed to make sure that we set up the right financing facilities for the new entity. So we worked with our financing specialist on the new entity, and on the other side, we were able to pay back that debt in full, and we actually were able to negotiate some quite significant payout concessions, if you like, which made the client very, very happy. In all of that, the last element was the surplus assets. So by doing the restructure, the new entity didn't have to buy those assets. They were surplus to requirements, so what's the point? They stayed in the old entity, and the old entity actually sold them, and the proceeds were used to pay out the bank debt, but also to pay out some creditor debts as well. And once that was all said and done, and the new entity operating efficiently, effectively in this brand new financing and requirement, and just has its assets that it needs, we were then able to liquidate the old entity.
Right. Okay. Well, again, thank you. I mean, it's very high level what we're talking about, but there's a lot of complexity in all of those things. But it's certainly, you know, the skills that we develop in dealing with the distress can be very useful tools when you're trying to downsize and bring it in. And some of that stuff people can do themselves. But having someone to manage all of the bits and make sure that nothing is missed in that process is really important. And the other thing in knowing the client that you're talking about, one of their comments was that by having someone deal with that, they could focus on repairing the business and doing what they needed to do to move forward.
Yep.
So the third one that I wanted to have a little bit of a chat about, and for people who have listened to me for a while on these webinars would know that I'm very passionate about this, and that is the health. Now, in this particular case, we're going to talk about it was a mental health one. And for those Victorians or those who love the AFL, you would have seen in the last week, we've had 2 senior coaches and a CEO all quit because they needed some space and time. Now, that's okay if you're in an employment role or a contract role where you can actually quit and someone else can take it on. What happens in our world as advisors and yours with all your clients, when they hit the wall like that, they can't just walk away. And I think the whole mental stress and is really starting to hit a lot of business owners. So it's a really relevant one. I'm not going to get into all the mental health stuff. We do have a webinar that if you want to refresh yourself on how to deal with people in mental distress, please just jump back on the website or give me a call and I can give you the link if you can't find it. But that's not the purpose of today. It's more to talk about how you were able to look after this client. So let's run through a little bit of the details on that one.
Okay. Leaving aside all her mental health issues, the reality of it was that her company actually wasn't doing too badly. But there was a significant event that had happened in her life. And because of that, it really impacted her personally and professionally. And it just meant she was unable to turn up to work every day, let alone unable to make, really simple decisions on a daily basis. And the longer that continued, the bigger a problem it became. And if you just let it continue without addressing any of the issues, as I said, it just gets it gets to be a bigger and bigger problem.
Yeah.
Now, stepping out of that business or any business is not an easy process. You can't just wake up and go, yep, I've had enough, taking my bat and ball and going home.
Yeah.
In our case, our client actually ran a franchise business. So if she had just shut the doors, it would have triggered significant personal guarantee liabilities for her in terms of her franchise obligations, her landlord obligations, and also bank debt, because in this instance, she had actually borrowed so that she could actually buy into that franchise. So there were all those issues to deal with.
and add a franchise on top of everything else, and it just takes it to another level, doesn't it? So, but again, that's a seminar for another day altogether.
Yes, definitely.
So how did you approach this one?
Effectively, just like any controlled exit, and I know you've talked about controlled exits or controlled shutdowns in this sort of forum beforehand, but the difference here was that we needed to do things quite quickly because she just was not coping, and there really wasn't the time or the opportunity to sell that business and take 2 or 3 months to advertise it and sell it. So we needed to do things quite quickly. What we did, we approached the franchisor, and we agreed with them that we would hand back the business so that they could run it so that they could have an opportunity to find an alternative tenant, which they ultimately did. That killed 2 birds with 1 stone for us, because it also meant that the new tenant, or the new operator rather, took over the lease. So there was that. And by doing that in a controlled manner, she felt as if she wasn't under too much stress. She knew the direction that we were heading in, and it just meant that we could address things in a calm, reasonable manner and address everything, not just 1 or 2 things.
Right. So you mentioned that there was a bank involved, and in my experience, the banks would have had a general security agreement, no doubt, which meant that the client wouldn't have been able to just hand back an asset without having to deal with them and talk to them at the same time, I would assume.
That's right. They did have a general security interest over the company. They also had a mortgage over her home, not only for her home loan component of the debt, but also, as I said earlier, she'd actually borrowed money to buy into this franchise. That loan was also secured against the home. So here she is now, she's not going to have a business. How does she service this debt? Spoke with the bank, and we also worked with one of our finance specialists, and we were able to get her some finance so she could pay back both the home loan debt, or refinance, I should say, refinance the home loan debt as well as the business loan debt. Once the business loan debt was paid off, obviously that released the GSA. So that meant that we could hand over the business to the franchisee and the ultimate new operator.
And being able to do this before you look at any liquidation process and all that sort of thing would have meant that would have helped her on the rates as well, I would assume.
Yeah, it did. But again, it was because we got in early, and it also meant that we could deal with everything and everyone. Particularly in her case, there were 3 big issues: the landlord, the franchisor rather, and the bank.
Well, and I think in this case, we didn't actually even need to look at liquidation in the end, because you were able to deal with everything so well. We could just deregister the company, I understood.
That's right.
Yeah, nice and easy. So it's nice
when you say it that way, it's nice and easy, yes. It's a long road.
Long road. So I mean, and again, knowing my passion for trying to manage mental health and deal with mental health, it's very cool to hear a story like that. Is there a nice little bow to wrap it up with to finish it off?
Well, it means this woman can now get up out of bed every morning without the drudgery of, having to face this business that she really did not want to be a part of. Yeah. She didn't want to run it, so we took that burden away from her. She's now found herself a new job. She was able also to get the professional help that she needed. So she and her family are actually doing really quite well at the moment.
Yeah, awesome. Really good, feel-good story.
It is.
So I think really and I appreciate you sort of pushing the barrow when we talk about what we're going to talk about in this webinar, was that really there are so many reasons why restructures need to occur, or shutdowns, or right sizing, and all that sort of thing. And the message that I think is really important that we're trying to get out there for everyone to listen to is that when you have something that's slightly out of the box, pick up the phone, have a chat to Sophie, have a chat to me, or any of the other strategists in the team Australia-wide, and just go, we're wanting to do this, and see if there's something that we can do to help. If there's not, we'll be the first people to tell you that we're not the right people for you, but we're more than likely able to send you in the right direction of someone if it's not us. If it is us, as you know, we'll put together a detailed plan at no cost to the client to try and come through with a plan, an idea and a concept for it. So, look, we're actually finished a little bit early today. I think we'll pretend it's all the full time for CBD point purposes, folks, but we're actually going to be able to buy yourself a little bit of time back today. We stayed completely on track today, Sophie, which is unusual for me, but you're keeping me on track. So before I start doing that sort of the wrap up stuff, do you have any final thoughts that you want to sort of throw out there to the group listening?
I suppose we all understand that as business owners, it's really, really difficult to make a decision that is outside of your norm, paying your wages, buying your widgets and making your widgets. This is not an easy decision. We understand that most business owners really don't know where to turn to. Some of them actually even think about it as failure and they're embarrassed about it. But if they come to us, we pass no judgment, make no calls, don't lay blame for past decisions. It's about how do we get them to move forward? How can we help them through that process? And I'm going to paraphrase you here before you get in on me. And I like this. It's better for us to say that you don't need us rather than you finding out later that you actually did need us.
Yeah. So you stole my line. I had that from my phone.
Yeah, I thought you might have.
So yeah, well, and thank you. Look, it's been great having you on today. It's been enjoyable. I'm really enjoying this series of actually talking with you guys as a strategist rather than just being Phil and I all the time. So his retirement's opened up some good doors. So thank you. I think our message, I guess, for today, everyone listening, is that it's, just pick up the phone and talk to us. It's not always going to be about the stress, but if you need to do something that's slightly out of the box, have a chat to us. We might have some solutions that you hadn't thought of. So, and I think some little tidbits of facts for those who didn't make our breakfast seminar that we were running across the place with SBRs. Apparently, the stats are that the average payment of all of the creditors' debt is 15 cents in the dollar. So those that have been done, the numbers have increased to about sort of 70 to 80 a month now, from about the 2 or 3 that it was when it first started. But the averages are running at about 15 cents in the dollar for paying back creditors, which is quite powerful when you consider that the ATO is generally a big player in all of those. And there's no doubt overall insolvency numbers are increasing quite rapidly. We're back basically to the same insolvency numbers that we had pre-COVID. So there was the average of the 17, 18, 19 years we're now back up to in 2023. April was slightly off target, but then if you look at it across the trend, April is always a bit the same that way. So I'll open up to if there are any questions that anyone has. So you can either put them into the chat, or you can raise the little electronic hand, and we can unmute you to have a chat if you need to. While you guys are gathering your thoughts and putting any questions in, if you have, Jazz will now put up the poll, which is our usual. Be really nice to Sophie. It's not about me. So put the poll up. That does help us. It does show that and we will be back to our normal time slot. We'll have, I think I've got James from our Sydney office is joining us next month. And although we're still finalising some of the topics, which we'll have out in the invites next week, there is going to be we're going to have a look at the VA process and the DOCA process and how that's all working in the current market, amongst some other things as well. So we'll just, no questions are popping up, Sophie. You're a lot of we've got thank yous there coming through in the chat bot. So from various people.
That's nice.
So if there's nothing else and no other questions, we'll say thank you very much, and everybody have a great day. Thank you for joining us again this month, and we look forward to seeing you again next month where we come up with a new topic again. All right. Thank you, everyone.